Well, we're very honored today to have General Miller with us today from Washington. He's on his way to testify tomorrow in Congress, so he's a busy man. I really appreciate him making the time to be with us. I'm going to turn this over to Senior Master Sergeant Retired John Turner for the introductory comments. Many of you know John. He worked with the Dean of the School of Nursing forever, and he did a great job there, but he's now over in one of our operations positions and facilities. So John knows General Miller very, very well. I don't think he's going to tell all the war stories, but he's going to introduce General Miller. Come on over, John.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Military Health Institute's 2023 Spring Luncheon. As General Hepburn said, I am John Turner, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Business Processes for Facilities Management. Previous to that, though, I served as General Miller's First Sergeant. So today is truly my honor. We are honored to welcome Lieutenant General Miller, who is a board-certified in general pediatrics, developmental behavioral pediatric, and is qualified in aerospace medicine. As an Air Force commander, he was the command surgeon for the U.S. Africa Command and is the former director of medical operations for the Office of the Air Force Surgeon General. He is now the Surgeon General for the Air Force and Space Forces, in which he directs a 44,000-person healthcare delivery system, serving 2.6 million beneficiaries, 76 medical facilities, with a budget of $6.1 billion. He oversees medical research and the development of health professionals. Please help me welcome him to the stage.
Good to see you. So good to see you. Good afternoon, and it's certainly my pleasure to be here. So, Dr. Hepburn, thank you so much for inviting me to this Military Health Institute Spring Lecture Series. In many ways, I've spent so many years in San Antonio for different jobs that it truly feels like being back home, and such a distinguished group. And I know we have a mix of folks either in the room or online. The distinguished folks, General Flowers, it is a pleasure to see you, sir. His son, General Flowers, works for me at the headquarters. So I will try to keep my comments to the point where even if you have very little knowledge about the military health system, Air Force in particular, that's not a requirement. But I apologize up front for those that have a whole lot of knowledge. But to spend this time, I did want to share with you kind of where we're headed. As you see, the topic, military health collaborations, research, education, and advocacy. There's so much goodness going on today between UT Health Science Center, the system in town, and I'm not going to restate the goodness that's already there, but to share with you where we're going as a Department of the Air Force, and also kind of some other opportunities out there, because I do think that between Air Force, Space Force, there are a lot of interesting collaborations that are being formed, and advocacy where I could see a role for the UT Health Science system. Right off the bat, I did want to just discuss a little bit about the history here. I mean, obviously, here we find ourselves in Military City, USA, where there is a strong contingent of really all services, but I would suggest primarily Army and Air Force. And granted, in comparison to the Army and Navy, the Air Force are kind of the new kids in the block in some ways, with our history dating back to 1947. But that being said, obviously we have a brand new service that we now are part of the Department of the Air Force, and that is our Space Force. That is literally only 2 years old, and when you kind of put things in perspective, we're talking about an Air Force that has some, give or take, 300,000 active duty. Our Space Force has 8,000. So, growing, much smaller, but that being said, still a learning process. a learning process for how that will be dealt with from a purely medical standpoint. Today, Air Force, we have airmen, Space Force, we have guardians. There's not such a thing as a Space Force medic. So today, every medic that takes care of either airmen, guardians, other beneficiaries are still all airmen. Down the road, that may be very different. But as it stands today, and we're in this growth market, it is still all under a Department of the Air Force. And so that's ultimately anybody in the Department of the Air Force. We all work for the Secretary of the Air Force, Honorable Kendall, and I've got a great job in D.C. working out of the Pentagon. I got two great bosses on the Air Force side of the house, General C.Q. Brown. And on the Space Force side of the house, we have our second Space Force Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman. And as you all may appreciate, the services are all about organize, train, and equip the forces in support of the warfighters. And who are the warfighters? Those are those combatant commanders. We call them COCOMs that are scattered throughout the world. And whether we're talking about CENTCOM, AFRICOM, EUCOM, those are the different organizations that when there's a need, they call upon an Air Force, a Space Force, to provide forces to support the mission. And in our case, obviously, it's a medical standpoint. Now, it's all about, as you see some of the documents up there, the National Defense Strategy, and we work further down. A lot of things you see up there about accelerate, change, or lose. That's from one of my bosses, General C.Q. Brown, on the Air Force side of the house. And I think it's spot on. You all watch the news, read the papers, you know what's going on in the world. And in some ways, very thankful that we're in a different place with COVID and other things going on, but there's equally a lot of other challenges that we need to be prepared for. And as medics, as we're coming back into training and we're able to do more again, there's a sense of urgency for all the right reasons. So when General Brown talks about accelerate change or risk losing, I think it's something to be taken very seriously. Not unique to the Air Force, but once again important. So when you hear Department of the Air Force, that's Air Force, Space Force. Similar to Department of the Navy, it is the Navy and Marine Corps, and a little different for the Army. So kind of working our way down, obviously, in talking about medical lanes, in my world, it is still about organize, train, and equip. And as I wanted to focus a lot on research and development, wanted to focus a bit on education and training, these are my top 4 priorities based on the guidance that I've been given from my bosses of where we need to continue to spend a whole lot of time and effort. And they're not in any particular order, but I don't think it should be a surprise to anybody. Aeromedical evacuation and en route care. That's the niche. That's what the AFMS does better than anyone else. If you consider the fact that our domain is air, now Space Force space. Obviously, the Army is a land component, and the Navy is all about, from a medical standpoint, care at sea. So we spend a lot of time, we do this very well, with our critical care air transport teams and other ways that we can move patients very long distances, oftentimes to bring them from a CENTCOM, Afghanistan environment, potentially all the way back to a burn center here in San Antonio. That second one, prolonged combat casualty care in expeditionary, austere, and space environments, is a big one. And it kind of reflects how the world is changing. And in fact, for some of you out there that know a little bit about Air Force medicine, for 20-some years, we've had a structure that dates back to a prior, very esteemed Surgeon General, P.K. Carlton, where we had the creation of something called our EMEDs. And they have stood the test of time. And a small EMEDs is about 40, 50 folks, which can expand to 7-bed, 10-bed, and then something large is something called an Air Force Theater Hospital. And that's worked really well in a CENTCOM environment where you have control of the air, and from point of injury to getting people to the next level higher next level of care is pretty quick, and you're less concerned about that transport. But the concern is that's not going to be the next fight. And irrespective of where we're talking about in the world today, we potentially have to get smaller, more lean, more agile. And so I can promise you that this time next year, I won't be talking about, for sure, not an Air Force Theater Hospital, and also probably not an EMEDS, but some force element, some structure that's going to be a lot smaller to best support the warfighters. And in the Air Force's case, what are those? Those are folks flying iron. Those are folks flying fighters, bombers. And where those folks go, we need to be very ready to move with them, and that may be in hours, kind of in a hub and spoke model. There's something called agile combat employment that I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but there are smart folks that deal with readiness that are working really hard back at the Pentagon on this very topic, with a focus on the medical piece and how we support the line. Aviation and space medicine. We've done aviation since day one in the AFMS, but space is a new arena, kind of exciting. It's one of the fun parts of my job, and I'll talk a little more about this as we kind of move along, and I think there's some opportunities for partnership there. And then finally, medical countermeasures for directed energy threats, something that I know is already, there's a lot of good work being done here in San Antonio, and involves the 7th, 11th Human Performance Wing and others. So once again, 4 priorities from my standpoint that probably won't be changing anytime soon. But if I can even dig a little bit deeper, and as I was talking about the fact that we are going to get smaller and leaner, and so it's going to be very common that a team that goes out of medics supporting a flying unit may have 5, 10 bodies. And it's not going to have the luxury of a larger EMED platform, the luxury of control of the air so that we can move folks easily, and may have to hold on to patients for a prolonged period of time. So what does that mean? Well, that means that it's all hands on deck. If you only got 5 folks, and maybe not everybody's clinical, well, we're leveling the bar in the Air Force Medical Service with something called Medic X that was started by my predecessor, General Hogg, as a former Air Force Surgeon General, that if you are a medic, it doesn't matter if you're a trauma surgeon or if you're an admin tech that works front desk, there will be a basic floor of skills that everyone will be expected to know. And there's 52 skills that we're breaking out into 13 different skill sets that we'll be training all Air Force medics across all 76 of our MTFs to have these skills. And that's going to be a big change. And I think for a lot of you that don't work in a military setting, obviously we have folks that are critical, whether they work as administrative types, whether they work in the pharmacy or the lab or other areas. But when you're potentially deployed in an austere setting, there's things that these folks can do to keep people alive and take care of our casualties. That is where we're kind of headed in the AFMS, because in the Air Force we like to say we fight from our flight lines. It's a little different, in the Army you're deploying, you're going someplace. Same with the Navy, you're going to sea. For the Air Force, you could be fighting from home at a Whiteman Air Force Base where bombers are going off, or at overseas at an Aviano or a Lakenheath with fighter planes. Or you may be at a Creech Air Force Base with unmanned aerial aircraft, or you could be at a Minot or a Malmstrom or an F.E. Warren at a missile silo. And so that fight is potentially from home. And we know in this world there's probably no protected place. So for our folks to have these skills at home or deployed is going to be critical moving forward. And it is about creating those ready medics that are prepared for the fight. So if I could switch gears and talk a little bit about space. I know some of you see this picture of General Schriever from 1957. This is right before NASA stood up. And don't for a minute think that the Air Force only got into the space mission with the stand-up of the Space Force. Obviously, we've been involved in supporting space operations for some time, and it's a very good thing. And as we are developing the Space Force, there's a lot of interest. I mean, they've got, as you see the logo on the right there, for those that are kind of Star Trek fans, it kind of looks that way. They're a smaller organization, as I mentioned, 8,000 active, maybe about 6,000, give or take, civilians. But a very flat, lean organization. They won't have MAJCOMs, major commands. They'll have field commands, and even name those in kind of a cool way. One is the Space Operations Center, known as SPOC. There's another Space Systems Command, and then another STARCOM, which is our Space Training and Readiness Command. So once again, it's a growth industry, and there's a lot of work to be done in support of the Guardians, although in my role as the SG, there's not a separate SG. Now, in the future, that might change. But right now, I support General Brown and General Saltzman equally, Air Force, Space Force. And just a quick timeline, as you see in this slide, how we have supported human spaceflight and continue heading in that direction with a stand-up in NASA back in '58. And once again, the Air Force has been involved with launch, orbit, recovery operations, really from the very beginning. And it's morphed over time. I would just direct you, obviously 2020 is a big date when Space Force stood up, but it's also when Space Comm, we talked about those combatant commands. So Space Force is no different than the Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines. You know, if you go to an event and you see all the flags, not everyone has a Space Force flag yet. It looks pretty good. It's a kind of a black-blue field of stars, but there's a Space Comm that sits with the headquarters in Colorado Springs. And once again, think of it as one of those warfighting domains, so that if that Space Comm commander joint needs support because of things going on in that space environment, it's important to have that. And the Air Force component to that is at the very bottom there. You see Aft Space Det 3. So a lot of new terminology and a little bit of confusion for folks in regards to how this is all broken out, but just wanted you to have at least a touch of where things stand. Now the rest of my comments are going to be a little more medically focused. And aerospace medicine, obviously, it's been around for a while. Started off in the Army with the Army Air Corps, pre-stand-up of the Air Force in 1947. You see some really interesting pictures up there. And as it started the Army and kind of moved down here to San Antonio for a period of time with the School of Aviation Medicine, and then finally his home at present is up in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So as it's transitioned from the Army to the Air Force, some of the challenges we've had are unique, but 1919 is not that long ago when you think about some of the things that we were learning to deal with. And then at the same time, pre-World War II, a young Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Groh, who became the first Air Force Surgeon General. This is prior to that, when he was still with the Army Air Corps. He stood up what became the Air Force Research Lab at Wright-Patterson. And so, once again, there's a lot of lineage there, connection with the Air Force. And as San Antonio is involved, obviously we have the Brooks City base, which has transitioned, a lot of the capability there has transitioned now to Dayton, but you have the Armstrong Lab, and I think that picture in the bottom left is actually, our father of space medicine, Dr. Harry Armstrong, where there was some thought early on that you can't jump out of a perfectly good airplane above 100 feet, or you would risk becoming unconscious or potentially die just from the fall. Now, granted, you need to have a parachute on, but Dr. Armstrong proved that false. And now you can see the things, obviously from space flight and different things that we are challenged to as we work with our partners in NASA and others. It really is amazing how far we've come. But the city of San Antonio has played a key role in a lot of these things over time. And so as we look in the space domain, I'll be honest, not my area of expertise, and I certainly have a lot to learn, but you do need to consider, when you look at all the things we do, from satellites to different ways that we make sure we know theoretically what's up there, and it's, anything over 50 miles, but, you have different orbits, low Earth, medium Earth, gravitational Earth orbit. It's very congested in space. And it's a challenging environment to work in, but unfortunately, it potentially will be a contested environment. And we have an International Space Station. It's there today. And I realize you've had some speakers that have come here from NASA in the past, but think about it. With all that's going on in the world, in that space station, we have U.S. astronauts with Russian cosmonauts in a very constrained environment together. And it's just kind of an interesting dynamic when you consider, what's at play and the partnerships and all the things that we now need to be concerned about, whether it's air or space. So moving on, obviously, when we talk about Air Force medicine and that aerospace environment, whether it is a manned aircraft, an unmanned aircraft, these are the areas that we're a little more comfortable with. There continues to be new advances, new amazing ways that we deliver air power on demand, and that's not changing. The part that sometimes we have to remind people of is this piece, and how dependent we are on everything aerospace, on those satellites, on all those folks. And it's more than just the aviators. It's all the folks working in those control centers. It's those folks working in missile launch facilities. It's those folks that are supporting others that are fighting, but dependent upon the information we get from the air and space, which is why it is important that we have a space comm in addition to having a space force. Now I'm going to switch gears again and really get a little more for the remainder of my talk into the research and then the kind of the education and training world. So I know there's a lot of partnerships going on today with the university and our 711th Human Performance Wing that sits out there in Dayton, Ohio. And as you kind of look at this wire diagram, the 711th that's their crest right there, dead center in the middle, and they are under the command of Brigadier General John Andrus, who is a flight doc, and he has two organizations under him, the Schoolhouse, School of Aerospace Medicine, and then the actual Airman Systems Directorate, which is more of the research arm of the 711th Human Performance Wing. And they all work for the Air Force Research Lab, which falls under AFMC, Air Force Materiel Command, and so this is a very successful relationship for us. Now granted, with the stand-up of the Defense Health Agency and the split, everything that is more delivery of the healthcare benefit, clinical, to include research and development, ideally falls under the DHA, and I know we have folks here from the 59th that are doing some of that clinical work, more focused on their interactions with the DHA, but still a linkage with the service. But if it deals with readiness, operational mission needs, that's service business, and that's where the 711 comes in, and in a very important way. And they have three divisions that you'll see underneath that systems directorate in the bottom right. One is involving, it's a biosciences division, and they're doing a lot of interesting things dealing with how do we take care of aviators in the cockpit and the use of wearables to detect fatigue and human performance enhancement. You may have read a little bit about even with our Space Force. I mean, they're interested, is there a way wearing maybe a watch and a ring that we can assess your fitness level over a year without ever having to take a physical fitness test, a PT test. And so those are the kind of things that are being looked at and worked at. Not quite there yet. A second division is bioeffects, and that deals with some of those directed energy weapons. Once again, something that is very important, the work that's happening in this town. And then finally, a warfighter readiness division that deals with more the human learning cognition side of the house. So a lot of interesting ongoing work that continues. But this is a little more about the 711th, and from the Secretary of the Air Force, those are his operational imperatives that help guide what the 711th Human Performance Wing is all about. And similar to kind of what's going on here at UT Health Science Center, they have 3 focus areas. They do research and development, they do a lot of training, and they also have a clinical arm. So they have a clinical consult service so that if an aviator has a particular unique need that can't be addressed locally, can this person fly, heart condition, eye condition, whatever, they go to Dayton and see some of these specialists that are part of the 711th working in that consult service. So once again, 3 arms, R&D, training, and a clinical piece. But is very important that this continues on in coordination with our other research hubs that are at some of our larger platforms, like a 59th Med Wing here at Lackland, in partnership also with the DHA. And with the 711th, we obviously, I'd love to be able to say we get all of our training needs accomplished within our MTS, within our facilities, but that would be unrealistic. Even though I would suggest that our MTFs are readiness training platforms, but we do need locations to enhance those skills. And for us, that's called C-STARS, the Center for Sustainment of Trauma and Readiness Skills. We have 5 C-STAR sites. Some are focused a little more on trauma, Baltimore shock trauma is an example. Some are a little more on AirVac, to include Cincinnati, St. Louis. We have a hub now in Las Vegas, and this is our newest hub that involves the University of Nebraska in Omaha. And it's all about movement of infectious patients. And obviously, if you're in the AirVac business, you can understand why this is kind of important to us. And to say we need to get better at this is an understatement. So we decided to partner with who I would say are probably the experts in the country. And those folks kind of located in the middle have been at this for a while. So whether it was dealing with a Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever patient back in 2009 or the first Ebola patient in 2014, they've been there and done that. And so today we actually have a group of medics embedded there at the University of Nebraska that are putting on courses for our medics. Initial course is called Principles of Biocontainment, just educating some of those smart infectious disease docs, nurses, techs on how to take care of these patients. But the next step is a course involving infectious disease air transport. Because let's face it, there's certain things you can do kind of last minute, just-in-time training, and I would suggest learning how to appropriately doff and don protective gear and all is not one of those things you want to do at the last minute. And you do want to have specifically trained folks if you're dealing with something, especially if it's lethal like an Ebola. But once again, if we are called upon to move patients by air and down the road potentially by space, having this level of knowledge is an important partnership and a growth industry for us. And so how do we do it? Well, COVID certainly pushed us a little bit to come up with different platforms. We started off early on with something called the TIS, the Transport Isolation System, which essentially was a bunch of PVC piping, hard plastic that can move a patient or two, but evolved into what you see up on this slide, an NPC that folks at the 711th had a lot to do with, a negatively pressurized Connex. So think of a big trailer kind of setup that you could put in the back of a large aircraft, and this can hold a lot of patients. And as you see up on this slide, max of 30 passengers, 22 ambulatory patients, 8 litters, with the right crew that understands how to take care of these folks with the doffing and donning procedures, safely being transported on the back of an aircraft from some distant part in the world, potentially back to a San Antonio or a Nebraska or wherever that next level of care would be at. But it's thanks to operational readiness research that is allowing for these kind of things to be developed, and it's pretty amazing. On top of, once again, those critical care air transport teams with our critical care doc and nurse and respiratory therapists that can handle some pretty sick folks. So it could be that in the back of one of these, or it could just be someone who has been exposed and obviously needs to move, but can't safely go on a run-of-the-mill aircraft. So a lot of ongoing work with this effort. But in the same regard, other things. Now, the intent was not to show, accomplishment after accomplishment of work that's being done at the 711, but this is a pretty cool tool that is being used today and was developed based on the needs of our war fighters and our medics, the BATDOC, the Battlefield Assisted Trauma Distributed Observation Kit. So this is one of those things that involves point-of-care injury. So someone is hurt on the battlefield, medics can go up to that person with a BATDOC, document their care, potentially also have resources at their fingertips. And then the cool part is that they can take this architecture and whether it is in a protected environment or not, they can encrypt it or send it to slide back to the receiving facility. This runs on open architecture, commercial off the shelf, can work with any sensor, and started off in our special ops community, very successfully used, but now is expanding, and it's going outside of the Air Force, so other services are using things. But once again, tools that are critical, that a need was identified by our medics and folks, whether it is a 59th Med Wing or folks at the 711th Human Performance Wing are developing tools like this and many others that are making our medics more successful in the battlefield. But as we kind of move forward, thinking of space and some of the opportunities there, wow, this is some of the challenges. I know I'm spending a fair amount of time meeting with some of the physicians and docs at NASA who want and need to partner with us. And that's exciting. I just came back from the Johnson Space Center down in Houston, and once again appreciating that there's very few places you can go today to train and be a specialist in space medicine. There is UT Health Science Center in Galveston. There is the Mayo Clinic has a fellowship program, but we need more in the Air Force to support the Space Force, and that is a growth market for us. So we know in civilian side, the Elon Musks of the world and the Jeff Bezos, whether it's SpaceX, whether it's Blue Origin, or they're sending rockets up, and that's going to continue to evolve over time. And there's quite a few present active duty members, as I know you've had a speaker here as one of our NASA astronauts who are supporting NASA, and so how do we best take care of those folks pre, post? It is about human performance optimization, whether it involves the air domain or the space domain, and there's a lot of opportunities for that. So one of the things that keeps me up at night, as you see in that bottom bullet, talking about Vanguard rocket cargo programs, of how do we move medical supplies, or God forbid, what if we got somebody in the International Space Station that needs to come back quickly? Because as you may appreciate, if there are crews of 4 or 5 people, you're not always guaranteed that you're going to have a medic as a member, and even if you do, you're limited in what capabilities they have. And what if that person is infectious, and how do we safely bring them back from that kind of setting? So there are opportunities there. I mean, that picture above is a picture of someone getting a dental exam, but I know I've spoken to an astronaut who had a bad tooth, and they're not going to bring that person back for bad tooth. So a non-medical astronaut was walked through how to pull that tooth on the International Space Station. And I would suggest that's a bad day for that astronaut with the pliers in their hand, and probably even a worse day for the person, maybe until the pain was gone, hopefully. But there's so much opportunity, and once again, the research initiatives that are being discussed and asked, and how things might work in that kind of environment. How would we do that, once again, as a partnership? So one of the things we've developed is an air and space aviation alliance that the Air Force has stood up. It's kind of a coalition of the willing that involves organizations like NASA, like the FAA, in addition to the other services, DHA, VA, but also higher higher schools of learning. So that may be an opportunity for UT Health Science Center to also be involved with that as we move forward, where we identify not only some of our success stories, but our gaps and learning from each other, because there's a false assumption that we all know what each other is doing, and we all are well aware of some of the unique advances that we've come across that might help and solve some of these problems. So it really is an exciting time as wearing my hat as a Space Force surgeon, partnering with NASA and the opportunity to send some of our medics there. So as I'm getting close to closing up here, and I apologize for going a little long, a lot of what-if questions. I mean, these are tough questions that I deal with when I think of the air domain. But throw on the space domain on top of that, because all these issues are still potentially relevant and an additional challenge for many unique reasons. That being said, still, once again, our niche in Air Force medicine is air-vac. This is what we need to continue to do better than anyone else. And you see some pictures up there of some things that occurred in Afghanistan that I'm sure many of you have read about, and success with CCAT support and others, and how do we do global health engagement. So this is not going away and moving patients long distances, but once again, how do you have that maybe that floating stretcher, something from Star Wars that would support patients in space coming off of a space station or something similar is where we're headed. And so here we are today, still pretty impressive air power, flight surgeons that are intimately involved with this mission. But in the future, space surgeons. And how do we function in this kind of a domain where we need to be equally as lean and agile to work in this environment, in this combatant command, and for whatever the future may bring. So I will end there. Once again, thank you so much for this opportunity to share just a little bit about what's going on. I do want to thank UT Health Science Center. I mean, there's this partnership. Everything that is present in the city is very special. And there's so many great opportunities here. And once again, it doesn't really matter in my mind whether it's Air Force, Space Force, Army, Navy, Marines. It is one big military health system. We so value our partnership with higher centers of learning like UT Health Science Center and the VA and others. And so, although tomorrow I'll be in a similar kind of a forum, but on the Hill talking to a bunch of senators, I'd much rather be here talking with you all, to be honest. And so this is the best part of my week, and it kind of goes downhill after that. But thank you again, and I open to any questions or comments you may have.
Well, I tell you what, I want to respect General Miller's time. He's got to get on a jet to get back to Congress. And we're anxiously awaiting his testimony tomorrow. But look, this has been an outstanding presentation. General Miller, thank you so much. And I want to thank your team back in Washington for putting everything together. For the students that are in the audience, you have a bright and important future. And for those that are on the net, and we're going to record this for our students and faculty, but this mission is vital. It's not just an Air Force mission, it's an Army, Air Force, Coast Guardsmen are involved with this. And this Space Force, really with these evolving challenges that we have as a nation, this university stands ready to partner with General Miller and the other services to make sure we're prepared to save lives, minimize suffering, and bring it back home in the years ahead. So thank you so much for attending today. General Miller, on behalf of the university, let me give you this small memento on behalf of your presentation. Thank you. Let's go over here.